A good strategy for life.
Yes, okay. So I'm recording from now, yeah, and I'm starting the interview. Dr. פיינברג, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us in Channel 13. I want to start off by asking you, you wrote about crashing the curve in 10 weeks in the United States. Do you think that this is feasible considering what we're seeing in the United States, not only theoretically, but also knowing the US and the way that it's built today, and the federal government, the states, and their governments? Do you think that it's actually possible?
It is possible, but it would take a lot of determination and decision-making at the highest levels to make it a reality. If you say what is probable in a positive way, I would say, I think it can happen, but maybe not for the whole country all at the same time. Particular states or counties or cities might be able to adopt many of the key principles and snuff out the pandemic in their region, and by doing that, show the way for others.
Right. And when you look at the United States and the way that this thing progressed, one of the amazing things, I think, not only about the United States, but also if you look at Spain, you look at Italy, to some extent, of course, the UK, is how probable this entire scenario was, both in the long-term view. If we look years ago, we were speaking about this possibility of a pandemic, either flu or coronaviruses. And also short-term, when it began in Wuhan, many people, epidemiologists, top of their fields, Mark Lifshitz in Harvard and others, said this is going to go global, this thing. And nation states didn't really prepare as they could have. How could we explain that?
Well, this, of course, is a question for the social psychologists, because when something occurs that dramatically alters our usual expectation, it's very hard to accept that possibility because it's so out of the ordinary. But you're quite right. If you look at the long term, we have repeated episodes of emergent infection. We had HIV years ago that was also a zoonotic infection from primates to humans. We had SARS the first, when it broke out in many parts of the world, but was containable. Mm-hmm. We had MERS, we had Ebola, we had the influenza H1N1 in 2009. So yes, we have had repeated episodes. To say that emerging infection is not only expected, it's expected with some regularity. Now, what was special about coronavirus was that it was easily transmitted from human to human. This is not true of many zoonotic diseases. Mm. It was capable of transmission in the pre-symptomatic or asymptomatic phase. You feel perfectly well, but the virus has invaded and you're capable of spreading it. It had a severe spectrum of illness, so that people who contracted the disease, many may have felt almost nothing at all or nothing at all, but the spectrum of severity increases dramatically with age and with other chronic disease. So you had the making of a very serious problem when you just looked clearly at each of the attributes of this particular virus.
I'm going to spend a minute talking about something which we really, in a sense, we shouldn't address anymore, but we should. And I'm talking about what I label in this country it's just the flu bunch. Okay, this kind of idea. Sometimes it manifests itself with people saying, we'll be looking back and we'll say, oh, we did too much with this. We shouldn't have. See how little people have died. At the end, in the greater scheme of things. But there is a real question here, because we cannot actually weigh in the risks here. for instance, not about mortality, because in a sense it's less important to see the mortality in the end, but for instance, how many people will be ventilated. And that's a really important thing that we would want to know, how many people would go and progress, in the clinical, more severe way, because then we can sort of weigh in our resources and say these things. And I'm wondering, how do you respond to these kinds of ideas, both the unserious ones, but mostly the serious ones, who are saying, look, we have to weigh in the risks. We don't have serological tests. We don't know how many people have been infected and immune. And you're taking us down a route that might be more deadly for health of the public than other routes.
Yeah. The crisis of the coronavirus, in my mind, is a war on two fronts. There is an economic and social front, and there is a biological front. And we have to fight both wars. You have to win both. The question is not trading off one versus the other. The question is, what is the smartest strategy to win on both? And in fact, in my mind, the smart strategy says, stop the biological threat as soon as possible, and then the economic result can follow as quickly as possible. The worst result, in my mind, is that we persist with continuing problem for a long period of time that inhibits people from wanting to go out and about, to live their lives, to spend money. The economy is continually constrained. We've neither defeated the epidemic nor have we really restarted the economy. That seems to me like a very unfortunate combination. The reality is, excuse me.
No, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
So the reality is that if we face up to the biological war, that front, and we do everything we should to quell the epidemic, we will be in a much stronger position to have a lasting and substantial economic recovery.
So let's start talking about these 6 phases that you talk about in that article. And one of the first things that you write there is to have someone who's going to run the show, to have a united command, to have, if you will, a corona czar that can actually handle this entire crisis and has the authority, in the case of the United States, the authority of the president in order to do what needs to be done. Why is that so important? Why is that the first thing that you write about?
In military strategy, the first principle is to establish a unified command. And the reasons are many, but the most obvious one is that it avoids confusion. It establishes a clear line of authority and action. It helps establish responsibility, and it enables everyone to work knowing how everyone else is working in a way that complements them. That's what a unified command accomplishes. Oftentimes, we can tolerate the inefficiencies of multiple people being involved and mixes of committees and separate responsibilities in different agencies. When you're in a war, when time counts, when the enemy is gaining, you need to bring everything together as best you can to attack each element that needs to be considered and defeated. Keep in mind, when you're fighting a war like this, a biological war, you have to do many, many things simultaneously. You have to deal with the sick. You have to make sure that the health workers are protected. You have to establish a surveillance intelligence system with the testing to know where is the enemy? Where is the enemy going? How strong is the enemy? You need to develop drugs and devices that will defeat the enemy when we are infected, better antiviral treatments, better management of patients who are clinically ill. So when you're trying to do so many different things and you don't have a unified command, there is every opportunity for confusion, for slippage, for oversight, for the blame game of who was responsible, it wasn't clear. All of these things are avoided with unified command structure.
I want to ask you about the difference between Asia and East Asia and what the West has been doing, because one of the amazing things, I think, is how slowly the West, and I'm also talking about my country, although geographically it's in Asia, but sometimes it wants to feel as though it isn't.
At least,
yeah, so it's sort of a near Asia thing. And,
yes.
and so slowly do we implement what they have implemented since SARS. So we see what's happening in Taiwan, in Singapore, even in South Korea, where they did have a major outbreak, or what looked like a major outbreak. And of course, what the Chinese did, and some of the things that they did, we don't want to do and we cannot do in democracies. But in the end, we are slowly progressing to every conclusion that they had, including face masks, including increased testing, including tracing, and mainly social distancing, to a radical measure that nobody predicted that we will implement. Why is that we didn't just say, oh, let's just do what they did, when the outbreak began?
Well, there are basic cultural differences. From the point of view of the West, for example, the idea of wet markets where you slaughter many, many different kinds of animals in public and have so much mixing of people and wild animals, it seems like it's designed to promote the infection in the first place. So it seems very strange to people from outside of the East that you would want to have that kind of market. On the other side, the fact that most Western countries do not routinely use face masks when you're ill seems very strange to people in Asia. They think that it's a common courtesy just to try to protect your neighbor when you have a cold even, never mind a flu or something like coronavirus. So there are these cultural differences. SARS was a very harsh teacher of Singapore, Hong Kong, Asian countries that suffered SARS. SARS was a killer. And SARS really, really established in those places a determination that they were going to be better prepared the next time. So they were better prepared. They did have the facilities. They did have the strategies. They did have the equipment that they needed to take care of their population. And so far, Singapore, Hong Kong have done pretty well. China, in the end, did as well as could be expected with Wuhan after it finally woke up to the problem and was past the denial stage. So we do have to keep our eyes open, learn the lessons from the places that have succeeded. We do obviously have to adapt them to our own values and our own way of doing things. But there is a way in which we could learn from the experience of others and use that to our advantage.
Can I ask you a bit about my country? My country has less than 9,000 people who were diagnosed. We are testing quite a lot compared to the world. Our problems are that we have, somewhat like in the United States, a lot of minorities, a lot of places that are much more condensed and poor in different parts of the country. So it's not homogeneous. Our infection rate in most of the country is R0 is about 1, maybe less than that. But in other places it can reach more than that. We double our numbers in 6 days. So the curve is quite flattened right now. And of course, Israel started quite early in saying to people who come from abroad, you're under mandatory isolation at your house, usually. And this measure probably prevented a wide-scale outbreak here. But we are seeing this progressing. So we have, dozens of people dead, and we have more than 100 in severe condition. And one of the things that some people are saying here, some officials, is that testing is not that important. So the media is pushing for testing, but they're saying, look, it's PCR is like 72%, 73%. We don't do CT as the Chinese did. We can't do that. And you're going to miss a lot of people. You're going to have a lot of false negatives, some false positives. And it's only plausible for these days that people are actually sharing the viral overload, viral load, and maybe we're too focused on testing. And of course, you know, the mainstream scientists in this country are saying, no, we need to test as many people as we can. So because I read the article, and I think it was the second or third element that you spoke about, I want you to elaborate after me doing this small presentation about Israel. What are your thoughts?
Testing is the analog of intelligence gathering in a war. If we don't test and we don't know who is infected, how widespread is the infection, and also, by the way, over time, who has antibodies and may be immune to illness, that's going to be also very important to know. It's very hard to apply our resources in the way that will optimize our ability to stop the infection. Mm-hmm. So, for example, in Israel, you have communities with very large families, and you have them living often in rather small quarters, close by to one another, intimate family interchange. Mm-hmm. And that is a perfect setup for silent spread of infection. So communities that are especially prone, vulnerable, and already, I would wager, expressing growth in infection, that's where you have to be especially vigilant in applying testing. In fact, it's going to be very interesting to see if Israel's experience plays out differently than other parts of the world. When you separate people physically, you turn the rate of growth of this virus infection down. It's like a boiling pot on the stove. It's a very full boil. You turn down the heat, but it's still simmering. There are still cases that are increasing. The epidemiologists say that the reproductive number is still a little above 1. So you're gradually, slowly growing the epidemic. You're not really stopping it. Yeah. Some of the things that you have to then be prepared to do to really stop the epidemic depends first and foremost on testing to identify a case, then contact tracing. Who is it who has had interaction with this person? And most prominently, protecting the family. Mm-hmm. And then probably you will have to find ways to quarantine that separate those who have been exposed, who are not yet infected, in a way that is apart from the others of their families, so they protect their families.
This is a huge row. I'm interrupting you because in this country at the beginning, there was a huge discussion. We brought in the media, I did, the recommendation of the WHO, in any case, not to allow home isolation for coronavirus infected people. Because of the experience in China and other places, South Korea, where it just failed, and they had these family clusters that you just talked about. And they basically said, what do you want us to do? And I guess this is also the question in the United States, you know?
Okay, what I would say, are your hotels full now with visitors? I suspect they're as empty as the hotels in the United States. Yeah. What would be wrong with taking a hotel, glatt kosher, making sure that everything is perfect, protecting every worker, training them about proper procedure, and that being a place for a time being to house those who either are mildly infected and they're in one part, or just being quarantined because they've been exposed. That would protect the family.
And they don't want to leave home, of course. And the health ministry is saying, if we're taking them outside of their house, they won't say to us, because they know that most of the cases, the disease is mild, they just won't tell us, you know, that they are sick.
We have to recruit the rabbis to help explain the reality of what it means to protect your family. You do not protect your family by exposing them to this virus. And what is your responsibility as a member of the family to your loved ones? It's as simple as that. And by the way, this hotel is not a punishment. This should be done with great courtesy and great service and great accommodation so that it is not a hardship to do your duty, because this is what it is. It's doing your duty. Now, the experience will tell. You will see whether in Israel, if you don't do this, how the epidemic proceeds. But to not test and not do this seems to me flying with blinders on. Why would you not want to know how well and how poorly you are doing?
No, Israel is doing a lot of testing. It's right now ranked 4th in the world in testing, but it's not very efficient testing in the sense that between the time that you're taking the test until you're getting the response, it's like 10 days. And, you know, so, yeah.
No, you need to have a test system that has a one-day turnaround.
I see. I want to ask you, beyond strategy, as a physician, as a researcher, Dr. Fineberg, what do you think is most interesting? What is the question that you would most want to know in a month, in a couple of months, about this disease and about its epidemiology?
Well, this is so many fascinating scientific problems. Number one, we would love to understand much more about this particular coronavirus. What makes it so readily transmitted from one person to another? Yeah. We would love to know about the susceptibility of some people and not others to severe illness as a result of this virus. Why do some get sicker than others? Is it just a matter of the inoculum? Is it just that is the amount of virus that they happen to have been exposed to? Is it something about their particular genomic or physiologic aspect? What is it about chronic illness that is predisposing to a more severe illness? So we'd love to know clinical information, epidemiologic information, information about a whole array of antiviral treatments and other approaches that could reduce the severity of illness. In terms of the epidemiology, we would love to understand more detail in the questions that we were just discussing. Exactly how much separation for how long is necessary in order to bring that reproductive number below 1? How long will it take for us to reduce this spread? Is there a seasonal variation with this virus that would affect the way in which it spreads? So we could go on. There are literally myriad scientific questions to be understood and investigated, and we do that with a purpose. We do that with a purpose of reducing the burden of death and disease from this virus.
I want to ask you one last question about our moment in history, because this is an incredible moment for history in general, and of course for medical history. So we are seeing the largest medical home isolation in history, of course, and we're seeing something that we actually couldn't do in other epidemics and pandemics in history, which is to say to many people, even in developing nations in the global south, stay at home, and they can do that, a lot of them, without starving. We couldn't do that in history before. And I'm sort of wondering, looking back at this moment, what would we say? Would we say, do you think, and I know it's a difficult question, that this was a heroic moment in which we could actually mobilize everything and beat a pathogen which had the possibility of being extremely deadly in absolute numbers, or we will look at this differently? I'm just wondering, what are your initial thoughts, your initial retroactive thoughts?
You know, it's a very speculative question that you're asking, to project ahead and to think about how would you look back. the most important thing to me is that we have it within our power to write that history right now. We don't have to wait passively to see what happens and then to look back at some time in the future and say, did we do the right amount? Did we do too much? Did we solve this problem? I believe that this epidemic cannot really be solved anywhere in the world until it is solved everywhere in the world, because we will all remain vulnerable to this virus until it is truly quelled all around the globe. Perhaps that will require a vaccine that is effective, safe, and widely deployed. The challenge and the question, how do we behave and how do we act and how do we protect our loved ones, our communities, our entire nations before the time when the vaccine is available? That's the history that I hope we will write in a way that we look back with pride.
Dr. Harvey Feinberg, thank you so much for this time you devoted. Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure to talk with you.
Okay, so I'm going to wish you a happy Pesach and
Pesach to you, indeed.
Okay.
It's